societies. Particular emphasis should also be placed on future preparedness and investment in areas that achieve security, peace, and prosperity for peoples. Therefore, the
The General Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I invite him to address the General Assembly.
Thank you. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, faithful late-night audience. It's customary for the British Prime Minister to come to this United Nations and pledge to advance our values and defend our rules, the rules of a peaceful world, protecting freedom of navigation in the Gulf, to persevering in the vital task of achieving a two-state solution in the conflict in the Middle East. And of course I'm proud to do all these things, but no one can ignore a gathering force that is reshaping the future of every member of this assembly. There has been nothing like it in history. When I think of the great scientific revolutions of the past, print, the steam engine, aviation, the atomic age, I think of new tools that we acquired, but over which we, the human race, had the advantage, which we controlled, and that is not necessarily the case in the digital age. You may keep your secrets from your friends, from your parents, your children, your doctor, even your personal trainer, but it takes real effort to conceal your thoughts from Google. And if that is true today, in future, there may be nowhere to hide. Smart cities will pullulate with sensors, all joined together by the Internet of Things. Bollards communing invisibly with lampposts, so there is always a parking space for your electric car, so that no bin goes unemptied, no street unswept, and the urban environment is as antiseptic as a Zurich pharmacy. But this technology could also be used to keep every citizen under round-the-clock surveillance. A future Alexa will pretend to take orders, but this Alexa will be watching you, clucking her tongue and stamping her foot. In future, voice connectivity will be in every room and almost every object. Your mattress will monitor your nightmares, your fridge will beep for more cheese, your front door will sweep wide the moment you approach like some silent butler. Your smart meter will go hustling of its own accord for the cheapest electricity, and every one of them minutely transcribing your every habit in tiny electronic shorthand, stored not in their chips or in their innards, nowhere you can find it, but in some great cloud of data that lowers ever more oppressively over the human race. A giant dark thundercloud waiting to burst, and we have no control over how or when the precipitation will take place. And every day that we tap on our phones or work on our iPads, as I see some of you are doing now, we not only leave our indelible spoor in the ether, but we are ourselves becoming a resource, click by click, tap by tap, just as the Carboniferous period created the indescribable wealth, leaf by decaying leaf, of hydrocarbons. Data is the crude oil of the modern economy, and we're now in an environment where we don't know who should own these new oil fields. We don't know who should have the rights or the title to these gushers of cash, and we don't know who decides how to use that data. And can these algorithms be trusted with our lives and hopes? Should the machines, and only the machines, decide whether or not we are eligible for a mortgage or insurance, or what surgery or medicines we should receive? Are we doomed to a cold and heartless future in which computer says yes or computer says no, with the grim finality of an emperor in the arena? How do you plead with an algorithm? How do you get it to see extenuating circumstances? And how do we know that the machines have not been insidiously programmed to fool us or even to cheat us? We're already using all kinds of messaging services that offer instant communication at minimal cost. And these same programs, platforms, could also be designed for real-time censorship of every conversation, with offending words automatically deleted. Indeed, in some countries, this happens today. Digital authoritarianism is not, alas, the stuff of dystopian fantasy, but of an emerging reality. And the reason I'm giving this speech today with this slightly gloomy proem is that the UK is one of the world's tech leaders, and I believe governments have been simply caught unawares by the unintended consequences of the internet, a scientific breakthrough far more reaching in its everyday psychological impact than any other invention since Gutenberg. And when you consider how long it took for books to come into widespread circulation, the arrival of the internet is far bigger than print. It's bigger than the atomic age, but it's like nuclear power in that it's capable of both good and harm. And of course, it's not alone. As new technologies seem to race towards us from the far horizon, we strain our eyes as they come to make out whether they are for good or bad, friends or foes. AI. What will it mean? Helpful robots washing and caring for an aging population, or pink-eyed terminators sent back from the future to cull the human race? What will synthetic biology stand for? Restoring our livers and our eyes with miracle regeneration of the tissues like some fantastic hangover cure? Or will it bring terrifying limbless chickens to our tables? Will nanotechnology help us to beat disease, or will it leave tiny robots to replicate in the crevices of our souls? It is a trope as old as literature that any scientific advance is punished by the gods. When Prometheus brought fire to mankind in a tube of fennel, as you may remember, with his brother Epimetheus, Zeus punished him by chaining him to a Tartarian crag while his liver was pecked out. I talked about a hangover cure. His liver was pecked out by an eagle, and every time his liver regrew, the eagle came back and pecked it again. And this went on forever. A bit like the experience of Brexit in the UK. If some of our parliamentarians had their way. In fact, it was a standard poetic practice to curse the protos heurates, the person responsible for any scientific or technical breakthrough. If only they had never invented the ship, then Jason would never have sailed to Colchis, and all sorts of disasters would never have happened. It is a deep human instinct to be wary of any kind of technical progress. In 1829, they thought that the human frame would not withstand the speeds attained by Stephenson's rocket, and there are today people who are still actually anti-science. A whole movement called the anti-vaxxers, who refuse to acknowledge the evidence that vaccinations have eradicated smallpox, and who, by their prejudices, are actually endangering the very children they want to protect. And I totally reject this anti-scientific pessimism. I'm profoundly optimistic about the ability of new technology to serve as a liberator and to remake the world wondrously and benignly. Indeed, in countless respects, technology is already doing just that. Nanotechnology, I mentioned earlier, revolutionizing medicine by designing robots a fraction of the size of a red blood cell, capable of swimming through our bodies, dispensing medicine and attacking malignant cells like some Star Wars armada. Neural interface technology is producing a new generation of cochlear implants, allowing the gift of hearing to people who would otherwise not be able to hear the voices of their own children. A London technology company has worked out how to help the blind to navigate more freely with nothing more than an app on their smartphones. New technologies produced in Britain, helping the deaf to hear and the blind to see. And we used to think that printing was something that you did to run off a boarding card. Now a British company has used 3D printing to make an engine capable of blasting a rocket in space. In African countries, millions of people without bank accounts can now transfer money using a simple app. They can buy solar energy and leap in one transaction from no electricity to green power. And new advances are making renewable energy ever cheaper, aiding our common struggle against climate change. Our understanding of the natural world is being transformed by genome sequencing, the discovery of the very essence of life itself, the secret genetic code that animates the spirit of every living being and allows medical breakthroughs the like of which we have never known, treatments tailored to the precise genetic makeup of the individual. So far, we have discovered the secrets of less than 0.3% of complex life on the planet. Think what will we achieve, what we will achieve when? And it is a matter of when we understand 1 or 2%, let alone 5 or 10%. But how we design the emerging technologies behind these breakthroughs and what values inform their design will shape the future of humanity. And that is my point to you tonight, my friends, excellencies. At stake is whether we bequeath an Orwellian world designed for censorship and repression and control, or a world of emancipation, debate and learning, where technology threatens famine and disease, but not our freedoms. 7 decades ago, this General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with no dissenting voices, uniting humanity for the first and perhaps the only time behind one set of principles. And our declaration, our joint declaration, upholds freedom of opinion and expression, the privacy of home and correspondence, and the right to seek and impart information and ideas. Unless we ensure that new technology reflects this spirit, I fear that our declaration will mean nothing and no longer hold. So the mission of the United Kingdom and all who share our values must be to ensure that emerging technologies are designed from the outset for freedom, openness and pluralism, with the right safeguards in place to protect our peoples. Month by month, vital decisions are being taken in academic committees, company boardrooms, and industry standards groups. They are writing the rule books of the future, making ethical judgments, choosing what will or will not be rendered possible. Together, we need to ensure that new advances reflect our values by design. There is excellent work being done in the EU, the Commonwealth, and of course the UN, which has a vital role in ensuring that no country is excluded from the wonderful benefits of this technology and the industrial revolution it is bringing about. But we must be still more ambitious. We need to find the right balance between freedom and control, between innovation and regulation, between private enterprise and government oversight. We must insist that the ethical judgments inherent in the design of new technology are transparent to all, and we must make our voices heard more loudly in the standards bodies that write the rules. Above all, we need to agree a common set of global principles to shape the norms and standards that will guide the development of emerging technology. So, and here's the good news, I invite you next year to a summit in London, a wonderful city, where, by the way, it is not raining 94% of the time. and where at one stage when I was Mayor of London or shortly before, we discovered that we had more Michelin-starred restaurants even than Paris. The French somehow rapidly recovered by a process that I wasn't quite sure was entirely fair. But we still have, by far, in the UK, by far the biggest tech sector. By far the biggest tech sector. Fintech, biotech, edtech, medtech, nanotech, green tech, every kind of tech in London. The biggest tech sector anywhere in Europe. Perhaps 500,000 people working in tech alone. And I hope that you will come there and we will seek to assemble the broadest possible coalition to take forward this vital task, building on all that the UK contribute to this mission as a global leader in ethical and responsible technology. If we master this challenge, and I have no doubt that we can, then we will not only safeguard our ideals, we will surmount the limits that once constrained humanity and conquer the perils that once ended so many lives. Together, we will vanquish killer diseases, eliminate famine, protect the environment, and transform our cities. Success will depend, now as ever, on freedom, openness, and pluralism. The formula that not only emancipates the human spirit, but releases the boundless ingenuity and inventiveness of mankind, and which, above all, the United Kingdom will strive to preserve and advance. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention.
I thank the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. This Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister and Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage and National Security and Intelligence of New Zealand. May I request protocol to escort Her Excellency.
Ko ngā tangata katoa, e manakitia ana te whenua, o te ao whānui, ko ngā kaitiaki, riti ana, ngā whenua, huri rau nā e te ao, me tu tātou ki te werohia ngā wero, i te ingoa o te tika o ngā mea katoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary-General, friends, I greet you in Te Reo Māori, language of the Tangata Whenua, or First People of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I do so not just because it is the same way I would begin an address if I were at home, but because there are challenges we face as a world that I know no better way to express. Māori concepts like kaitiakitanga, the idea that each of us here today are guardians. Guardians of the land, of our environment, and of our people. There is a simplicity to the notion of sovereign guardianship. For decades we have assembled here under the assumption that we narrowly cooperate only on the issues that overtly impact on one another. Issues like international trade rules, the law of the sea, or humanitarian access to war zones. The space in between has essentially been left to us. We, the political leaders of the world, have been the authors of our own domestic politics and policies. Decisions have been our own, and we have ultimately lived with the consequences. But the world has changed. Over time, we have become increasingly interdependent. We see more and more often domestic decisions that have global ramifications. Physical events have taught us that in obvious ways. Oil spills that show no respect for maritime boundaries. Nuclear accidents and testing, the impacts of which are never confined to the exact location in which they occur. But our interdependence, our connection, runs so much deeper than that. And experiences in recent years should lead us all to question whether any of us ever truly operate in isolation anymore. This is a question that we, the remote but connected nation of New Zealand, have been grappling with this year. There are things that we are well known for in New Zealand. Green rolling hills, perfect, you might say, for hobbits to hide in and for plenty of sheep to roam. We're known for manaakitanga, or the pride that we take in caring for our guests. So much so that it even extends to our most entrenched sporting rivals. And now we're known for something else. The 15th of March 2019. The day an alleged terrorist undertook the most horrific attack on a place of worship, taking the lives of 51 innocent people, devastating our Muslim community, and challenging our sense of who we are as a country. Now, there is no changing a nation's history, but we can choose how it defines us. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the people who lined up outside of mosques with flowers, the young people who gathered spontaneously in parks and open spaces in a show of solidarity, the thousands who stopped in silence to acknowledge the call to prayer 7 days later, and the Muslim community who showed only love. These are the people who collectively decided that New Zealand would not be defined by an act of brutality and violence, but instead by compassion and empathy. Make no mistake, though, we do not claim to be a perfect nation. While we are a home of more than 200 ethnicities, that does not mean that we are free from racism or discrimination. We have wounds from our own history that 250 years on from the first encounters between Māori and Europeans, we continue to address. But since the terrorist attack in New Zealand, we have had to ask ourselves many hard and many difficult questions. One example sticks in my mind. It was only days after the shooting and I visited a mosque in our capital city. After spending some time with community leaders, I exited and walked across the car park where members of the Muslim community were gathered. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw a young boy gesture to me. He was shy, almost retreating towards a barrier, but he also had something he clearly wanted to say. I quickly crouched down next to him. He didn't say his name or even hello. He simply whispered, "Will I be safe now?" What does it take for a child to feel safe? As adults, we are quick to make the practical changes that will enable us to say that such a horrific act could never happen again. And we did that. Within 10 days of the attack, we made a decision to change our gun laws and banned military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles in New Zealand. We've started on a second tranche of reforms to register weapons and to change our licensing regime. These changes will help to make us safer. But when you're a child, fear is not discreet, and it cannot be removed through legislative acts or decrees from Parliament. Feeling safe means the absence of fear, living free from racism, bullying and discrimination, feeling loved. included and able to be exactly who you are. And to feel truly safe, those conditions need to be universal. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter where you live. The young Muslim boy in Kilburnie, New Zealand, wanted to know if I could grant him all of those things. My fear is that as a leader of a proudly independent nation, this is one thing that I cannot achieve alone. Not anymore. In our borderless and technologically connected world, commentary on race, acts of discrimination based on religion, gender, sexuality or ethnicity, they are not neatly confined behind boundaries. They are felt globally. The fact I received so many letters from Muslim children from around the world in the weeks after March 15 speaks to the power of connection. These children had no sense of distance. They may have never heard of New Zealand before March 15. They just saw an act of hatred against their community and it felt close to them. Whether it is acts of violence, language intended to incite fear of religious groups, or assumptions about ethnicities to breed distrust and racism, these actions and utterances are as globalized as the movement of goods and services. Children hear them. Women hear them. People of faith hear them. Our rainbow communities hear them. And so now it is our turn to stop and to listen. To accept that our words and actions have immeasurable consequences. And to speak not only like the whole world is listening, but with the responsibility of someone who knows a small child somewhere might be listening too. The spaces in which we communicate, they are part of the challenge too, though. In an increasingly online world, we need to create spaces for the exchange of ideas, the sharing of technology and free speech, while also acknowledging the potential for this technology to be used to cause harm. March 15 was a staggering example of such harm and a deliberate effort to broadcast terror on a massive viral scale over the internet. The alleged terrorist didn't just take the lives of 51 people. He did it live on Facebook. In the first 24 hours after the attack, Facebook took down 1.5 million copies of the live stream video. YouTube saw a copy of the video uploaded at times as fast as once every second during the same period. The alleged terrorist used social media as a weapon. The attack demonstrated how the internet, a global commons with extraordinary power to do good, can be perverted and used as a tool for terrorists. And so what happened in Christchurch, as well as being a profound tragedy, is also a complex and ongoing problem for the world. And it's a problem we felt a sense of responsibility to do something about. So we sought to collaborate with the technology companies so integral to the solution. 2 months after the attacks, leaders gathered in Paris for the Christchurch Call, bringing together companies, countries, and civil society, and committing to a range of actions to reduce the harm this content can cause. In doing so, we have kept our focus on the deeper aim we all want. Technology that unleashes human potential, not the worst in us. Yesterday, I met with Call supporters to check in on our collective progress. We announced that a key tech industry institution will be reshaped to give effect to those commitments, and we launched a crisis response protocol to make sure that we can respond to such events should they happen in the future. Neither New Zealand nor any other country could make these changes on their own. The tech companies couldn't either. We are succeeding because we are working together. And for that unprecedented, and powerful act of unity, New Zealand says thank you. The centrality of technology in our lives, it's not the only example, though, of our increasing interconnection and our reliance on one another if we are to respond to the challenges we face. There is perhaps no better example of our absolute interdependence than the issue of climate change. When the United Nations Secretary General visited the Pacific region this year, he saw firsthand how countries that have produced the fewest greenhouse gas emissions are now facing the most catastrophic effects. In his words, to save the whole planet. In fact, 7 out of the 15 most climate-affected nations in the world sit within the Pacific region. Places like Tuvalu, with a population of just over 11,000 people, barely contributes to global emissions, but is paying the price for our collective inaction. Atolls so low-lying that in weather events, the water on either side of it can flow together and join at the narrowest points, engulfed by the sea. Or Tokelau, a beautiful set of 3 atolls that can only be accessed by boat, where the children speak knowledgeably about climate change, knowing that unlike all of the challenges their self-reliant forebears have ever faced, this is the one that is completely and utterly in other people's hands. Now, they have never met you, and nor you them, but I can tell you that their expectations on all of us are high. Meeting those expectations will require us to use every policy lever available. And just like the Christchurch call to action, we need to work with partners inside and outside government to make change. In New Zealand, we have plenty of work to do. We may only make up 0.17% of global emissions, but like so many others, our gross emissions have been rising steadily since the 1990s. And that's why we have coupled ambition with action. Over the past 2 years since we took office, New Zealand has produced our own zero-carbon legislation, which puts our domestic economic transformation in line with the objective of a 1.5-degree limit in global temperature increases. We've continued with our goal of planting 1 billion trees. We've created a $100 million green investment fund. We've stopped issuing new offshore oil and gas exploration permits. We're creating a plan to achieve 100% renewable electricity generation and to incentivize low-emission transport options. And we're supporting our Pacific neighbours with projects to increase solar power, reduce the use of diesel generators, protect coastlines, and stop seawater from entering water supplies. But some answers to the climate challenge are easier than others. The vast bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, don't come from transport, energy generation or waste, but from one of the things that we pride ourselves on, our food production for the world. We know this requires us to adapt. In fact, our farming leaders have made their own commitment to cutting emissions from food production. Over the next 5 years, we will collaborate with farmers to build systems in New Zealand which every farmer will be able to use to measure, to manage, and to reduce their own farm's emissions. We are doing this because we are unique. Agriculture makes up nearly half of our greenhouse gas emissions, setting us apart from our OECD counterparts. But we won't stay out there on our own for long. When other countries cut pollution from traditional sectors like energy and transport, their profiles will start to look more and more like ours does today. New Zealand will never produce all of the food that the world needs, no matter how many sheep you may think we have. But we can produce the ideas and the technology that the world needs for everyone to farm and to grow in the most sustainable way possible. New Zealand is determined to do good and to be good for the world. And that is why we are also focused on tackling the billions of dollars that countries spend annually on fossil fuel subsidies, billions that could instead be spent on transitioning to new forms of clean energy generation. Despite commitments to phase out such subsidies by groups like the G20 and APEC, we are still struggling to see concrete action. It is time to do things differently. New Zealand will once more be calling on countries to support an end to fossil fuel subsidies at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference in June 2020. And this week, New Zealand, alongside a group of like-minded countries, will also announce the launch of a new initiative that applies trade levers to climate-related goods, services and technologies. It's time for trade deals to become a force for good on climate action. They need to stop allowing perverse subsidies that incentivize pollution and finally remove tariffs on green technology. Fossil fuel companies should no longer reap the benefit of subsidies that many, like our farmers and others, have been asked to give up. Without the billions in subsidies that go into the fossil fuel industry, green energy can compete on an even footing. It's both the most fair and economically consistent thing to do. My question is, will you join us? And this is where we return to the concept again that challenges our modern political environment. We are being asked to make decisions that are local, but with consequences that are global. And yet, this is what climate change requires us to do. This is what historically our commitment to the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights asks us to do. It's what standing up against acts of violence and discrimination asks us to do. Our globalized, borderless world asks us to be guardians, not just for our people, but for all people. There may have been a time when being unified under common challenges was an easier concept than it is today. But undeniably, we are living in a time where our greater reliance on one another has collided with a period of greater tribalism. Now, it would be wrong to assume that this is a new phenomenon. Research, in fact, has shown that humans are so inclined to form natural tribes that if you put a completely unconnected, diverse group of people into a room and flip a coin for each, those two groups will automatically form a suspicion of one another based on nothing more than heads versus tails. Scientist and writer Robert Sapolsky recently reminded us that humans organize, whether it's class, race, country, or coin flipping. There has always been a tendency to form us versus other. But he also asks the question, what if we change what us means? Instead of fierce nationalism or self-interest, we seek to form our tribes based on concepts that can and should be universal. What if we no longer see ourselves based on what we look like, what religion we practice, or where we live, but by what we value? Humanity, kindness, an innate sense of connection to each other, and a belief that we are guardians, not just of our home and our planet, but of each other. We are borderless, but we are connected. We are inherently different, but we have more that we share. We may feel afraid, but as leaders we have the keys to create a sense of security and a sense of hope. We just need to choose. Tātou tātou, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
I thank the Prime Minister of New Zealand for her statement just made, and I request protocol to escort Her Excellency.
نواصل الآن المناقشة العامة.
We will now continue with the general debate. And the General Assembly will now hear an address by Madam Theresa May, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I would like to request protocol to accompany Ms. Theresa May.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Kingdom, let me begin by paying tribute to an outstanding leader of the United Nations who sadly passed away this summer. Kofi Annan was one of the great Secretaries General, a tireless campaigner for peace and progress, and a champion of human rights and human dignity, whose influence will continue to be felt around the world for years to come. Over the course of his lifetime, he witnessed the extraordinary progress that we as a community of nations have made since this organisation was founded. Progress in which we have more than halved the number of people living in extreme poverty in this century alone. Progress in which the number of people killed in conflicts has fallen by 3/4 in just over 3 decades. And progress in which millions of our citizens lead healthier and longer lives, and where, thanks to advances in human knowledge, in medicine, in science and in technology, we are presented with huge opportunities in the years ahead. Yet today, many are concerned about whether this progress will continue, and fearful about what the future holds. For the end of the Cold War did not, as many once believed, lead to the inevitable supremacy of open economies and liberal democracies, cooperating on the global stage for the common good. Today, instead, we face a loss of confidence in those very systems that have delivered so much. The belief in free markets has been challenged by the financial crisis of 2008, by the concerns of those feeling left behind by globalization, by the anxieties about the pace and scale of technological change and what that will mean for jobs, and by the unprecedented mass movements of people across borders with all the pressures that can bring. And after the military interventionism at the beginning of the century, people question the rationale and indeed legitimacy of the use of force and involving ourselves in crises and conflicts that are not ours, while at the same time being repelled by the slaughter in Syria and our failure to end it. These doubts are entirely understandable. So too is the demand for leadership. So those of us who believe in inclusive societies and open economies have a duty to respond, to learn the lessons of the past, to meet people's concerns with practical actions, not beguiling illusions, and to renew our confidence in the ideas and values that have done so much to benefit so many for so long. For be in no doubt, if we lack the confidence to step up, others will. In the last century, whether in the rise of fascism or the spread of communism, we have seen those on the extreme right and extreme left exploit people's fears, stoke intolerance and racism, close down economies and societies, and destroy the peace of nations. And today, once more, we see worrying trends in the rise of these movements in Europe.